now you've got to be wondering why the Chick-fil-A cows are on the bulletin cover and why I have this grand picture of him up on the wall. What in the world does that cow have to do with God or the church? Because I did pick the Chick-fil-A cow for a reason. Because this isn't just any cow, is it? When you see that cow, what do you think? You think chicken, exactly. But it's a cow. We don't think about beef or milk or farms or even manure when we see that cow. That cow's being has been completely transformed. Cows and chickens have come to represent the exact same thing. But they aren't really, are they? I mean, a cow is still a cow, no matter how you dress it up. And a chicken is still a chicken, whether it ends up in a sandwich, an egg carton, roosting in a barn someplace. There's nothing that we can do to change this. But the Chick-fil-A company has single-handedly been able to alter the way in which people view cows. They've been able to make cows and chickens represent the same thing. Since the dawn of creation, we have been doing this also. I've sat in many discussions where we've said there are things in our lives that can become like gods to us. As a matter of fact, I read a prayer that the whole corporate church wrote this morning that said that we can turn things to be like gods. And we don't really think that they are God, like God with a capital G, but with like a little g. And these things can vary for all of us. You know, the things can be, there are all those things that take priority in our lives. So it might be work, or it might be working out. It might be traveling, or it might be television. It might be coffee. For me, it might be Mountain Dew. The truth of the matter is we can turn anything into a little g God. So we will all acknowledge, in theory at least, that while we may break the first commandment by putting other gods before the one true God, we aren't necessarily denying the existence of God. Almost as if to say, well, sometimes it's just hard to trust that much. We need something to fill up the void of it, while we're waiting for God to come down off the mountain, or send us a sign, or have something to say. So in our heads, God still exists, along with all of our other little gods. However, most of us will purport that the little g gods aren't nearly as compelling as the big G God. But that is not what's going on in the story today. God has been replaced. God exists for sure. It's just that now God exists for the Israelites doesn't look a thing like he's supposed to. God is now a cow, even though God's a chicken. See, their imaginations run wild. And I think what we're apt to believe is that they've grown tired of standing around at the base of a mountain waiting for Moses to show up. And they are. But I think things actually went askew a little bit before this. Because the Israelites say, we do not know what has become of him. Moses, the man who brought us out of Egypt. Who brought them out of Egypt? Moses? Moses or God? understanding at this point. Moses did. Moses has become their God. At some point along the journey to the mountain, or as they looked back over the events that brought them to this point, they started thinking that God had very little to do with their being liberated from the hands of oppression, and very little to do with guiding them through trials and tribulations. God had very little to do with saving their lives, and Moses had everything with saving their lives. Moses cared. Moses saved them. Moses and God had become one and the same. They trusted Moses, and then he left and went up the mountain. And so their imaginations run wild again. And the text doesn't say this, but their actions do. Our imaginations can convince us of anything. So what their actions say is that God doesn't care. See, God has left us again to go up the mountain. Maybe we need to do something in order for God to exist. Maybe God's actual existence is up to us. Maybe it's something we imagine. So the golden calf is fashioned and actually becomes God. And I know, and you know, that the golden calf isn't God, but the Israelites don't know this. And they don't care, because they need it to be God. Now, I don't usually do this, but I do think it's really important today. See, the way that it's translated here, it doesn't demonstrate the fact that they are indeed trying to fashion the one true God. Because the Hebrew word for God can be singular or it can be plural. It can be God or it can be gods. It can be God with a little g or it can be God with a big G. Now both translations will work, but what they do after they've made the calf shows us that at some point they trusted the calf more than they trusted God. They had probably been struggling a lot with trusting God before the calf even shows up on the scene. Well, who knows how exactly it happened, but possibly all the time and energy and love and care they put into making the calf made it seem so much more real than God. Because they made it. And then they declared with joyous celebration, "Let tomorrow be a festival to God." To the cow God. And God's heart broke. And I really believe it did. Because as I read it and I experience it, I believe that God watched in disbelief. Because it's the only explanation of why God lashes out at Moses. It isn't that God thinks the people are actually Moses' people. God's pretty clear on who his people are. It's that God's heart is broken. And while it's odd to think, the Bible supports it. God is jealous, not only of a calf, but of Moses too. The Israelites have not only found a way to encapsulate God, but they found a way to give all of themselves to something that isn't God. And the only way to do this is to truly believe that the calf is God. Now you would think that they would get the problem here, or at least the difference. That if they actually fashioned the calf out of gold that was in their possession, then there's no way it can actually be God. But they've lost their imagination. Or better yet, they've misplaced it. They did, after all, make a cow out of gold at the base of a mountain in the middle of a desert. How they were actually able to do this, I'm not quite sure, because that took a lot of imagination. Turning Moses into God seems a bit more plausible to me. And I'm not trying to really let them off the hook, but at least he was alive. At least he could converse with them. At least he did something. If I was making a God, I would want one that could walk and talk. A calf can do nothing except the one thing that they needed. The one thing that we all need. Someplace to place our trust. We all want this. Some place or someone in whom we can place our trust. Don't we all want something larger than who we are? There has to be more. Well, what they did is they made God so much smaller. What we do is we make God so much smaller. As they made God, they not only lost what God looked like, but what God actually is like. They imagined that Moses and God were one and the same, that the calf and God are one and the same. And that's the farthest thing from the truth. Just as we know that no matter how many commercials are put out with cows purporting chickens, cows will always be cows, and chickens will always be chickens. See, maybe they didn't lose their imagination, but they lost their imagination to trust. What they've been doing is imagining trust into something instead of having the imagination to just trust. They don't have the imagination anymore for a living and loving God that can be trusted. They've been wavering all throughout the journey, claiming that God hates them, that God's promised liberation only to lead them out into the wilderness to kill them. So the question for you today is, do you, or do I, have the imagination to trust that God is who God says, a living and loving God who can be trusted with our very lives? Because there is a difference, and I want you to hear it. There is a difference between imagining trust to exist and having the imagination to trust. And it's hard to explain, but one is built on falsification and the other is built on reality. And the best way I could come up with explaining it, because I think it is so important, is this. When we're in kindergarten, the one thing that is crucial to us being able to learn is our imagination. And it is capable of falsifying reality, but the only way in which we begin to learn that there's more than we can comprehend is by trusting our imagination. We go into it with there's more to find out, not what can I make these numbers add up to. We wait and see. Imagining trust means just that you imagine it to exist, because it didn't. But the imagination to trust is based on what has been known to you, not by you. What has been fashioned for you, not by you. When we see a cow, we can think chicken if we want. But we can't think God and get anywhere close to all that God is. If we want even a glimpse of what it is we are trusting, then we have one place to look that we would never have imagined. And then, only then, we might get a glimpse of how much God would truly do anything to liberate and love us. And look there. No cow, no chicken, no person of our own design can do that. No matter how hard we imagine to try that they can. Only God. Only the one true